Barry Sautman. He is an associate professor of social science at University of Hong Kong Science and Technology. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Barry. First of all, as a university professor yourself in Hong Kong, I'd just like to get your thoughts on what's happening at the Polytechnic. Do you support this action, or do you think they've really just gone too far?
Well, the Hong Kong Polytechnic still has a small number of people who are basically holed up. It's much diminished from what it was originally. They probably had 600 or 700 people in there originally when the siege began, and now there's perhaps 60 or so left. The campus itself has been thoroughly trashed. It'll take many months for it to be repaired. Whether or not they have a spring semester as planned remains to be seen. Now, as for the purposes of taking over that campus and of a number of violent actions that have taken place over the course of the last couple of months especially, the way it's being portrayed to the world is that this is a leaderless movement for democracy. But the violent protests are not leaderless, and they're not for democracy. They are not leaderless in the sense that many of the nativist groups, which have existed in Hong Kong now since around 2012, have been very active in organizing those violent protests. And those nativist organizations are like nativist organizations that are common in Europe or in North America or other parts of the world. They are organizations which despise a particular ethnic group. In this case, it's Chinese mainlanders. They are for the separation of Hong Kong from China, so they're pro-independence. And of course, not all the people who are involved, even in the violent protests, have that position. But nevertheless, those are the main leaders of those kind of protests.
It's very interesting that you actually have highlighted the divisions within the protest movement itself, because those could manifest and become very important in things going forward. But I need to ask you, while I have you, Barry, about the U.S. action now taken to support the protest movement as a whole. Do you think it should be welcomed at this point, or is it, fanning the flames of the fire, so to speak?
Well, the people who've led the violent protests particularly are people who like Donald Trump. They like Nigel Farage in Britain, etc. That is, these are people who are fellow nativists. And so they appeal to them. And they've made a major push, of course, in the U.S. Congress to convince U.S. politicians that China is all bad. Everything that's bad that happens in Hong Kong is a result of Chinese input. And that's easy enough to do because the U.S. Congress is a place where both the Republicans and the Democrats have pushed over and over again in the last couple years to condemn China. There's 150 different anti-China bills before the U.S. Congress at present. And of course, there's a big trade war between the United States and China. And China is looked upon as the long-term strategic rival of the United States. So easy enough to get the politicians in the United States to condemn the Chinese government for what goes on in Hong Kong. But in fact, it probably has rather little input to what has been done in Hong Kong. This has been made in a major way a decision of the Hong Kong government.
Very interesting.
And the effect of the law, which will be passed by the U.S. Congress and probably signed by Donald Trump, is probably not going to have a great effect on Hong Kong itself. If it does have an effect on Hong Kong, it'll certainly be negative. And therefore, most people in Hong Kong actually don't want this law to come into being because they're worried about the economic effect. Hong Kong's already been severely damaged, and this will just contribute to the further damaging of Hong Kong. And of course, it will make relations between the United States and China even worse.
Okay. Quickly, Barry, if you can. I want to get your perspective as well as an expat actually living in Hong Kong. Do you think young people have kind of been pushed to take some action Have you seen the territory change significantly since the handover? Or do you think the one country, two systems model is actually working and not quite being appreciated?
Well, the territory of Hong Kong has not changed in a very significant way in the 22 years since the handover back to China. It hasn't changed in a very major way because Hong Kong is the very model of a neoliberal system in the world. Milton Friedman, the famous conservative American economist, always recommended Hong Kong as the place where there was small government and big market. And this has created the most unequal country or region of any of the developed areas of the world. And there's a great deal of discontent in Hong Kong about that. And unfortunately, though, none of the political forces in Hong Kong have addressed the grave social problems that exist here. And certainly these grave social problems are background to the demonstrations which have occurred recently in Hong Kong. If those problems are not addressed, then there won't be any long-term solution to the conflagration which Hong Kong has now been pushed into.
Okay, Barry Sautman joining us there. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks for your insight.